The first police cruiser screeched to a stop so hard the tires left black streaks across the asphalt, leading to the old iron bridge. A second cruiser pulled in behind it, lights washing the riverbank in flashing red and blue. Within seconds, half the neighborhood was standing on the opposite side of the water, shouting over each other. I stood quietly beside the freshly installed steel gate. A heavy chain wrapped through the entrance. A brand new private property, no trespassing sign gleamed in the afternoon sun. Behind me stretched nearly 1,500 acres of forests, pasture, and rolling hills that had belonged to my family for almost a century. In front of me, an entire upscale subdivision, over 200 expensive homes. Every one of them depended on this single bridge. The bridge I'd sold 3 days earlier. A woman in a cream-colored business suit shoved through the crowd, her face bright red with rage. "You can't do this," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger across the river. "These people have jobs. Kids have school tomorrow." I recognized her immediately. Melissa Harrington, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, the same woman who had spent the last 6 months insisting I had no legal rights over their bridge, the same woman who'd mailed me violation notices, threatened lawsuits, demanded access to land she didn't own. Now she looked like someone watching her entire world collapse. I folded my arms. "I already did." Her mouth dropped open. "You sold our bridge." I shook my head. "No." I let the silence settle. "I sold my bridge." The crowd erupted. "You trapped us." "This is illegal. We're prisoners." A man in golf clothes yelled, "Call the governor if you have to." Someone else shouted, "He's holding an entire neighborhood hostage." Children were crying. Dogs barked. Phones were recording every second. One officer approached carefully, removing his sunglasses. "Sir," he said calmly, "I'm Officer Daniel Ruiz. Can we talk?" "Of course." He glanced at the locked gate. "The residents are saying you've blocked the only road into Cedar Ridge Estates." "They're correct." "And this bridge? It sits entirely on private property." He nodded slowly. "Did you install this gate?" "No." His eyebrows rose. "The new owner did." That answer visibly confused him. "The new owner?" "I sold the bridge, along with the 10-acre parcel surrounding it." He looked back toward the furious crowd. Melissa practically ran over. "Officer, arrest him!" Ruiz frowned. "For what?" "He intentionally trapped an entire community." I couldn't help smiling. "No, Melissa." I reached into my truck and handed the officer a thick folder. Inside were survey maps, county records, property deeds, closing documents, the recorded sale. Every page stamped by the county recorder. Ruiz flipped through them silently. The color slowly drained from his face. He turned toward Melissa. "Ma'am." She stepped forward hopefully. "Yes?" He closed the folder. "This bridge wasn't owned by your HOA." Her expression froze. "It wasn't owned by the county either." She stared without blinking. "It appears," he continued carefully, "your entire subdivision has been using private property for over 20 years." The shouting stopped. Completely. Even the wind seemed to disappear. Melissa whispered, "That's impossible." Another police officer walked over. After speaking into his radio, dispatch confirmed the deeds. Ruiz rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, folks." He looked from the crowd to the locked gate. "This is a civil property matter." Melissa's voice cracked. "So you're just leaving?" "We don't have authority to force a property owner, or a property's new owner, to open a private bridge." Hundreds of residents stared in disbelief. Someone behind Melissa whispered one sentence that sent chills through the crowd. "If the bridge isn't ours, how did they build this neighborhood in the first place?" I looked across the river at the faces of people who had spent months treating me like an unwanted trespasser on my own family land. None of them knew the truth yet, neither did the police. But hidden inside my grandfather's old cedar chest was one forgotten document that would explain exactly how an entire HOA had been built on borrowed access, and why someone had spent decades making sure it stayed buried. People always assume a fight like this starts with one bad neighbor or one angry HOA president. It doesn't. It starts years earlier, with quiet assumptions that slowly become accepted as facts. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 48 years old, a licensed civil engineer turned ranch owner, and until all of this happened, I lived a life so predictable most people would have called it boring. I preferred fixing fences over attending parties, spent my mornings riding horseback through the pastures, and ended almost every evening on the porch of my grandfather's farmhouse with a cup of black coffee, while the sun disappeared behind the western ridge. I liked silence. Silence never lied. The 1,500 acres surrounding me had been in my family since 1929, when my great-grandfather returned from working the railroads and purchased what everyone then considered worthless land. Over the decades, the Mercers raised cattle, harvested timber responsibly, restored streams, and fought more than one legal battle to keep developers from carving the property into subdivisions. Growing up, my grandfather, Walter Mercer, always told me the same thing whenever we'd ride out to inspect the fences. "Son," he'd say, patting the worn leather saddle, "land doesn't just belong to you. You're borrowing it from the next generation." Back then, I thought he was just being sentimental. Years later, I realized he was trying to prepare me. When he passed away 2 years earlier, he left everything to me. Not because I was the oldest grandson, because I was the only one who had stayed. The inheritance wasn't just acreage. It came with responsibility, unpaid maintenance, aging equipment, forgotten records, and enough property taxes to make most people panic. Still, I never considered selling. This place wasn't an investment, it was home. Across the river sat Cedar Ridge Estates, perfect sidewalks, decorative stone entrances, neatly trimmed lawns, luxury SUVs in nearly every driveway. From a distance, it looked like the picture of suburban success. Truthfully, I barely interacted with anyone there. The residents waved if they happened to drive past while I was repairing a fence, and I waved back. That was the extent of our relationship. Or so I believed. Every morning, I watched hundreds of cars cross the old steel bridge connecting the subdivision to the county highway. The bridge had always been there. I crossed it occasionally to reach town, and so did everyone else. It never crossed my mind that anyone questioned who actually owned it. Why would they? One Saturday morning, I was repairing an irrigation line when my neighbor, Tom Alvarez, pulled his dusty pickup alongside the fence. Tom owned the ranch bordering my western property and had lived there nearly 30 years. He climbed out, removed his cap, and leaned against the truck. "You got company?" I looked toward the road. 2 luxury SUVs had stopped near the bridge. Several people in matching polo shirts were measuring something with laser equipment. "Developers?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "HOA board." I laughed. "They're on the wrong side of the river." "So I thought." We watched for another minute. One woman pointed toward my side of the bridge, while another man made notes on a clipboard. Tom frowned. "Feels strange." "What does?" "They're measuring like they own something." I shrugged it off. "They're probably planning landscaping." "Maybe." But he didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. The following Monday, I found bright orange survey flags driven into the ground, on my side of the bridge. At first, I assumed the county had scheduled maintenance. I pulled one out. Another appeared the next day. Then 5 more. Someone had even spray-painted utility markings across the gravel road leading into my pasture. I called the county engineering office. The woman who answered checked their records. "No county projects are scheduled anywhere near your parcel, Mr. Mercer." "You're sure?" "Positive." That was the first knot in my stomach. 2 days later, while driving back from the feed store, I noticed workers removing brush along the entrance to my property. Without asking, without knocking, without even acknowledging me. I parked my truck beside them and stepped out. "Afternoon, gentlemen." The workers exchanged nervous looks. One finally answered, "Afternoon. Who hired you?" He hesitated. "The HOA." I blinked. "The HOA hired you? To work on my property?" He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "That's what we were told." Before I could ask another question, a black luxury SUV rolled onto the gravel. A woman stepped out wearing sunglasses, a tailored cream blazer, and the kind of confident smile that wasn't really a smile at all. She walked toward me as if she were inspecting an employee who had shown up late. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "That's right." She extended a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Melissa Harrington, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I didn't shake it. Instead, I looked past her at the workers standing on my land, then back at her. "Can you explain why your contractors are clearing trees on my property?" For the first time, her smile faded, just enough for me to notice. Then she calmly said something that made absolutely no sense. "We're simply maintaining HOA infrastructure." I stared at her. "What infrastructure?" She looked directly toward the old bridge. The bridge, of course. And in that moment, something felt terribly, terribly wrong. I followed Melissa's gaze to the old steel bridge. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The workers stood frozen, chainsaws silent, pretending they suddenly found the gravel beneath their boots fascinating. Finally, I broke the silence. "You mean my bridge?" Melissa gave a patient smile, the kind people use when they think they're explaining something obvious to a child. No, Mr. Mercer. The Cedar Ridge Access Bridge. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. There isn't a single thing called the Cedar Ridge Access Bridge on my deed. There's a steel bridge located on parcel 14B of Mercer Ranch. She folded her arms. That may be how it's described on older paperwork. Older paperwork, I repeated. My family has owned this land for nearly 100 years. She nodded as though agreeing with me somehow proved her point. Exactly. Property descriptions change over time. I stared at her. No, deeds don't. Her smile disappeared. Regardless, the HOA has maintained this bridge for years. Maintained? Painting, snow removal, guardrail repairs. I looked at the faded beams stretching across the river. My grandfather replaced those guardrails himself. Melissa tilted her head. I'm afraid you've been misinformed. That sentence hit harder than I expected. My grandfather had spent his life on this ranch. He kept handwritten maintenance logs for everything from cattle vaccinations to fence posts. To hear a complete stranger casually erase decades of his work made my jaw tighten. I'm going to ask you once, I said evenly. Take your contractors off my property. Melissa didn't move. I'm afraid we can't do that. You can't? No. And why is that? Because this is HOA infrastructure. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them quietly shut off his chainsaw completely. I looked directly at him. You gentlemen have 10 minutes to gather your equipment. Melissa stepped between us. I wouldn't do that. Oh? We have permits. Show me. She reached into a leather portfolio and handed me several papers. At first glance, they looked official. County logos, engineering diagrams, permit numbers. But something immediately caught my attention. The permits authorized landscaping inside Cedar Ridge Estates. Nothing referenced my parcel. Nothing authorized work west of the river. I handed them back. These stop at the subdivision entrance. They include bridge maintenance. They don't include my ranch. Her voice sharpened. The bridge is part of the HOA. No, I replied calmly. You keep saying that. It doesn't make it true. Her face flushed. You are interfering with authorized work. I took a step closer. No. I pointed toward the survey stakes. You're trespassing. For the first time, the workers began quietly loading tools into their trucks. None of them wanted to be standing between two people arguing over land ownership, Melissa noticed. Nobody leaves. One worker looked at her nervously. Ma'am. I said nobody leaves. He looked at me. I'm sorry, sir. We honestly thought this belonged to the neighborhood. I know, I answered. You've got 5 minutes. Melissa immediately pulled out her phone. If you're forcing our contractors off HOA property, I'll have no choice. I already knew who she was calling. 9 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies rolled onto the gravel road. Deputy Aaron Collins climbed out first. He was probably in his mid-50s, calm, weathered, and clearly not interested in unnecessary drama. His younger partner followed, carrying a tablet. Collins walked toward us. Afternoon. Melissa practically intercepted him. Deputy, this man is interfering with HOA maintenance and threatening contractors. Collins looked at me. Your property? Yes. She interrupted immediately. No. He held up a hand. One at a time. He asked for identification from both of us before looking around. So what's actually happening here? I explained everything from the survey stakes to the permits. Melissa responded with absolute confidence. The bridge has always belonged to Cedar Ridge. Collins scratched his chin. You have a deed showing that. We have decades of maintenance records. That's not what I asked. Her expression tightened. Our attorney has all the documentation. So you don't have it today? No. He turned to me. You have your deed. I keep copies in the truck. Within 2 minutes I returned, carrying a waterproof document case. Collins spread the survey map across the hood of his patrol SUV. The younger deputy zoomed in using county GIS maps on the tablet. For nearly 5 minutes, neither officer spoke. Melissa crossed her arms impatiently. Finally, she asked, Well? Collins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed at the digital parcel lines. This is interesting, Melissa smiled. I know. No, Collins replied. I don't think you do. He turned the tablet so everyone could see. According to the county GIS records, the bridge, and every foot of land supporting both ends, sat entirely inside Mercer Ranch. Melissa stared at the screen. That's wrong. It updates directly from county tax records, the younger deputy said. It can't be wrong. She shook her head violently. Our attorneys said... Collins interrupted. I don't care what your attorneys said. He looked at me. Mr. Mercer, do you want these workers removed? Yes, he nodded once, then turned toward the contractors. Gentlemen, pack everything up. Melissa's voice rose nearly an octave. You can't seriously be siding with him. I'm not siding with anyone. Collins kept his voice level. I'm preventing a trespassing complaint until ownership is determined. But it's our bridge. Then prove it in civil court. She looked like she'd been slapped. As the contractors began driving away, she stepped closer to me, lowering her voice so only I could hear. This isn't over. I didn't think it was. She leaned in even farther. You have no idea who you're fighting. I met her eyes without blinking. I was about to say the same thing. That evening, just before sunset, I found something tucked beneath my front door. No envelope, no postage, just a single typed letter. Across the top, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Final notice of non-compliance." But it wasn't the threat that made my blood run cold. It was the signature at the bottom. The HOA had somehow listed my own family land as property located within Cedar Ridge Estates. Someone hadn't just made a mistake. Someone had rewritten history. I read the letter 3 times before setting it on my kitchen table. The words didn't become any less absurd. Final notice of non-compliance. It ordered me to remove unauthorized barriers, obtain HOA approval before making improvements to my lot, and attend a disciplinary hearing the following Thursday. According to the letter, I had accumulated over $18,000 in fines for violating landscaping standards, failing to maintain community property, and obstructing emergency access. My lot, not my ranch. Not 1,500 acres, a lot. Whoever wrote it had reduced nearly a century of Mercer family history to something that sounded like a suburban backyard. I turned the page over. Nothing. No explanation. No supporting documents. Just Melissa Harrington's signature beneath the words, Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I walked into my grandfather's old study, a room that still smelled faintly of cedar, pipe tobacco and machine oil. Most people saw shelves of dusty binders and filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. I saw my grandfather. Walter Mercer believed in writing everything down. Every purchase, every repair, every handshake, every disagreement. Paper remembers when people don't, he'd always tell me. That sentence echoed in my head as I opened the first filing cabinet. By midnight, I'd found maintenance records dating back 40 years. Bridge inspections, invoices for steel beams, receipts for concrete, cancelled checks written by my grandfather to local welders. Every expense had been paid by the Mercer family. Not once did I find a payment from Cedar Ridge Estates. Not once. If the HOA truly owned the bridge, why hadn't they spent a dime maintaining it? The next morning, I called someone I'd trusted since my engineering days, Rebecca Lawson, 56 years old. One of the sharpest real estate attorneys in the state. Rebecca wasn't dramatic. She wasn't impressed by emotional arguments. She cared about facts, which was exactly why I wanted her involved. Her office overlooked the county courthouse, and by the time I arrived carrying 3 banker boxes filled with records, she'd already cleared her conference table. She looked at the stack and raised an eyebrow. Buying another ranch? I wish. She smiled faintly. Then this must be serious. It is. For nearly 2 hours, I walked her through everything. The survey stakes, Melissa's claims, the deputies, the violation letter, the bridge. Rebecca rarely interrupted. She simply took notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Something doesn't fit. I know. No. She tapped the violation notice. I mean legally. She reached for the county GIS printout. If your parcel has always included the bridge, it has. Then no competent attorney would tell an HOA they own it without documentation. So where's the documentation? She folded her hands. That's exactly the question. By noon, Rebecca had filed requests for every recorded deed, easement, subdivision plat, planning commission filing, and development agreement related to Cedar Ridge Estates. If someone transferred rights, she said, we'll find it. And if they didn't, her eyes narrowed. Then someone built an entire neighborhood, assuming nobody would ever check. 3 days later, we met again. This time, another person joined us, Harold Bennett, a 73-year-old retired county surveyor. If there was anyone who knew property lines better than computers, it was Harold. He arrived carrying a worn leather tube filled with oversized maps. I heard Walter's grandson finally started asking questions, he said with a grin. You knew my grandfather well. We argued about fences for 30 years, he laughed. Never once caught him wrong. Harold carefully unrolled a massive linen-backed survey dated 1987. Unlike modern digital maps, this one had been hand-drafted. Every creek, every fence, every boundary marker, everything. His finger traced the river. Here's Mercer Ranch, then the bridge, then the subdivision. Rebecca leaned closer. What am I looking for? Harold frowned. Exactly. There isn't an easement. He checked another map, then another. His expression slowly changed. I don't like this. Why? I asked. He looked directly at me. Because there should be one. Rebecca immediately understood. If a subdivision depends on one access road, the developer records permanent ingress and egress rights. Harold finished. It's standard practice. And if they didn't? Harold was quiet for several seconds. They'd never receive final approval. The room fell silent. Rebecca stood and walked to the window. Unless, Harold nodded slowly, unless somebody convinced everyone an easement already existed. I felt my pulse quicken. So we're looking for a missing document? Rebecca shook her head. No. She turned back toward me. We're looking for proof that the document never existed. The following afternoon, Rebecca received a call from the county recorder's office. The clerk sounded confused. There are gaps. What kind of gaps? Rebecca asked. Development records for Cedar Ridge. Missing pages? No. The woman hesitated. Missing files. Rebecca's face hardened. How many? Enough that someone requested them before. Who? I'm not supposed to say. Rebecca calmly replied. This matter is already headed toward litigation. The clerk sighed. I probably shouldn't tell you this. She lowered her voice. But someone checked out those records 22 years ago. Rebecca grabbed her pen. Did they return them? Another long silence. Then came the answer that changed everything. No. The original county file, documenting how Cedar Ridge Estates received approval, had vanished more than 2 decades earlier. And according to the checkout log, the last person to sign it out wasn't a developer. It wasn't an attorney. It wasn't even a county employee. It was Melissa Harrington's father. Rebecca stared at the checkout log for several long seconds before sliding it across the conference table toward me. There it was. One line, one signature. One date. Checked out by Richard Harrington. Date, April 18th, 2004. Return date, blank. I looked up. Melissa's father. Rebecca nodded slowly. The same Richard Harrington who developed the first phase of Cedar Ridge Estates. Harold Bennett let out a low whistle. I remember him. You do? I asked. Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He was ambitious, smart, always in a hurry. Anything else? He hesitated. Your grandfather never trusted him. That didn't surprise me. What happened? Harold stared toward the window, as though replaying memories from decades ago. Richard came into the survey office several times, asking about access rights across Mercer Ranch. And? Your grandfather refused every proposal. For an easement? Harold nodded. Permanent access. Rebecca looked at me. Did Walter ever mention that? I thought about every conversation we'd ever had, every horseback ride. Every evening on the porch. Then one memory surfaced. I was maybe 15 years old. We had stopped halfway across the bridge while checking fence lines. Grandad rested both hands on the railing. Never let anyone convince you this crossing belongs to somebody else. Back then, I thought he was simply reminding me where our property line ended. Now those words felt entirely different. He knew, I whispered. Rebecca looked up. What? My grandfather knew someone wanted this bridge. Harold slowly nodded. I think he expected this fight. That afternoon, Rebecca filed an emergency motion requiring the county to search archived engineering records stored off-site. Most counties digitized everything, but older subdivisions often had boxes of original plans sitting in climate-controlled warehouses. If anything had survived, it would be there. 2 days later, we drove to the county archives. An elderly records supervisor named Linda Foster met us in a warehouse filled with shelves stretching farther than I could see. I wasn't expecting lawyers today, she joked. Rebecca smiled politely. We're looking for anything related to Cedar Ridge Estates between 2002 and 2005. Linda disappeared for nearly 40 minutes. When she returned, she pushed a dusty cart carrying 6 oversized boxes. These weren't in the recorder's office. Where were they? Rebecca asked. Engineering archives. Harold immediately started opening folders. Subdivision grading plans, stormwater permits, environmental studies, road construction inspections. Then, a sealed envelope slipped from the bottom of one box. Across the front, in faded handwriting, were 5 words. Access negotiations, Mercer property. Harold looked at me. You should open it. Inside were photocopies of letters exchanged between Richard Harrington and my grandfather. The first few were polite. Requests to purchase a permanent easement. Offers of $250,000. Then $500,000. Then $1.2 million. Each offer had been rejected. My grandfather's final response was typed on a single page. Mr. Harrington, my answer remains no. The bridge is private property and shall remain so. Future access may be negotiated only through a revocable license, never a permanent easement. Respectfully, Walter Mercer. Rebecca immediately looked at Harold. He never sold access. Harold smiled. He refused. But the subdivision still got built. Exactly. I flipped through the remaining documents. Near the bottom was a yellow engineering memo. It had been overlooked because it wasn't addressed to anyone outside county planning. The final sentence was highlighted in red. Final subdivision approval. Contingent upon recorded legal access prior to occupancy. Permits. Rebecca's eyes widened. They couldn't legally build a single house without recorded access. Harold whispered. Then how did they? Before anyone answered, Linda spoke from across the room. There's one more box. She carried over a thin cardboard file labeled Planning Commission Minutes. Inside was a transcript from the final approval meeting. Near the end, one commissioner asked a direct question. Has the Mercer access issue been resolved? The developer's attorney answered, yes. Necessary documentation has been secured and will be recorded before occupancy. Rebecca looked at me. That's a representation to a government body, but there wasn't any easement. No. She carefully closed the folder. If they never recorded one, they obtained approval under false pretenses. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Rebecca smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. We've got them. I frowned. Not yet. Oh, Ethan. She tapped the engineering memo. This isn't just about property anymore. It's fraud. News traveled faster than I expected. Less than 48 hours after we obtained the archive records, someone leaked word that I was preparing a lawsuit. My phone started ringing constantly. Unknown numbers, blocked numbers, voicemails with no message. Then the emails began. Some begged me to think about the families. Others accused me of trying to destroy an entire neighborhood. One anonymous message simply read, "Sell the bridge back before someone gets hurt." Rebecca immediately told me to preserve everything. Don't delete a single message. The pressure intensified. Local social media exploded. Residents posted photos of me repairing fences, calling me a greedy millionaire. Someone edited a picture of me standing beside the locked bridge with the caption, "The man holding 600 families hostage." Reporters started parking outside my ranch entrance. Drones flew over my fields. One evening, I found fresh tire tracks leading nearly half a mile onto my pasture. My cattle had been spooked through a broken fence. When I reached the bridge, I found red spray paint across the old warning sign. 3 words. We know where you live. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the message. Fear tried to creep in. It didn't stay long. Instead, I pulled out my phone, took photographs from every angle, and called Rebecca. When she answered, I said only one sentence. They've stopped defending their case. She immediately understood. They've started trying to intimidate you. The next morning, she filed our complaint in county court. Attached to it were hundreds of pages of evidence, property deeds, survey maps, the missing archive records, the negotiation letters, the planning commission transcript, and one request that would change everything. Rebecca formally asked the judge to order Melissa Harrington, the HOA board, and the original developers company to produce every internal record related to the bridge, subdivision approval, and access rights under oath. For the first time since this began, they wouldn't be able to hide behind threats. They would have to answer questions. In court, the courthouse was already surrounded by news vans when Rebecca and I pulled into the parking lot just after 7:30 that morning. Satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Camera crews rehearsed their introductions. Residents from Cedar Ridge filled the courthouse steps in clusters, some holding homemade signs that read, "Save our homes," while others simply watched in uneasy silence. 6 months earlier, many of those same people had believed I was just a stubborn rancher refusing to cooperate. Now they were beginning to realize the fight had never really been between me and their neighborhood. It was about whether they'd been told the truth. Rebecca adjusted her briefcase as we walked toward the entrance. Nervous. I smiled faintly. Ask me after it's over. She chuckled. I've known you 15 years. And? You only smile like that when you're pretending not to be. She wasn't wrong. I had spent months preparing for this day, but knowing the facts and sitting inside a courtroom were two completely different things. The courtroom itself was packed. Every bench was occupied. Late arrivals stood along the back wall. Several local reporters sat with laptops already open. Near the front, Melissa Harrington sat beside three attorneys in expensive charcoal suits. She looked polished as always, but the confidence she'd carried during our first confrontation had been replaced by something far less comfortable: fatigue. She hadn't looked directly at me once. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered. She was known throughout the county for one thing: she hated games. After reviewing the docket, she looked over her glasses. This court expects truthful testimony from every witness. Her eyes paused briefly on both legal teams. If I discover otherwise, there will be consequences. The room fell completely silent. The HOA's lead attorney, Charles Benton, stood first. He projected confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this unfortunate dispute stems from a misunderstanding over historical access rights." Rebecca leaned toward me and whispered, "He just admitted they don't have ownership." I looked at her. "Already?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. He changed the wording. Instead of saying ownership, Benton kept saying historical access. It was subtle, but it mattered. For nearly 30 minutes, Benton argued that Cedar Ridge residents had relied upon the bridge for decades and that removing access created an unreasonable hardship. He spoke about school buses, emergency vehicles, property values, families, children. Everything except one simple question: who actually owned the bridge? When he finally finished, Judge Whitmore asked quietly, "Counselor, before we continue," he looked up. "Yes, Your Honor. Can you identify the recorded instrument granting your client's legal access across Mr. Mercer's property?" The courtroom held its breath. Benton adjusted his glasses. "We believe such documentation once existed." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Believe? It appears county records are incomplete." She looked down at her notes. "So your answer is no?" He hesitated. "At present, yes." Rebecca stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Harold Bennett." Harold walked slowly to the witness stand, was sworn in, and settled into the chair. Rebecca approached with a rolled survey map. "Mr. Bennett, what was your profession?" "I served as county surveyor for 38 years. Were you involved with Cedar Ridge Estates during development?" "Yes." She unrolled the original 1987 survey across an easel. "Can you identify this document?" "I drafted it." "Does it accurately show the Mercer property boundaries?" "It does." She pointed toward the bridge. "Where is the bridge located?" Harold never hesitated. "Entirely inside Mercer Ranch." "No part of it?" "Not 1 inch." Benton stood immediately. "Objection." "Basis?" Judge Whitmore asked. "The witness is relying on outdated surveys." Rebecca calmly walked to the clerk's table. "Permission to approach?" "Granted." She handed the judge 3 modern county GIS maps, 2 tax parcel records, and an updated licensed survey completed only weeks earlier. Judge Whitmore examined them carefully, then looked at Benton. "They all say the same thing." Benton slowly sat back down. Rebecca continued. "Mr. Bennett, in your professional opinion, could Cedar Ridge have been lawfully approved without permanent legal access?" Harold answered with one sentence, "No." "Why not?" "Because state subdivision regulations prohibit approving a landlocked residential development." The jurors exchanged glances. Even several residents seated behind Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca nodded. "No further questions." The next witness changed everything. Linda Foster, the county archive supervisor. She testified about discovering the forgotten engineering boxes and the missing recorder's file. Rebecca held up the original checkout log. "Miss Foster, who signed out the subdivision approval file?" Linda adjusted her glasses. "Richard Harrington." "And was it ever returned?" "No." Benton jumped to his feet. "Objection. This witness cannot speculate regarding events 22 years ago." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I'm not asking her to speculate." She held up the county logbook. "I'm asking her to read what's written." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Overruled." Linda read directly from the official record. "Checked out April 18th, 2004. Richard Harrington. No return recorded." The courtroom erupted in whispers before the bailiff called for order. Melissa finally looked at me. Her face had gone completely pale. Rebecca wasn't finished. "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Melissa Harrington." For the first time that morning, Melissa looked genuinely frightened. She walked to the witness stand with slow, measured steps. After taking the oath, Rebecca approached. Miss Harrington. Yes. You've repeatedly stated your HOA owns the bridge. That's correct. Rebecca placed a single document on the witness stand. Can you identify the recorded deed conveying ownership to the HOA? Melissa stared at the paper. Several long seconds passed. Finally, she whispered, I can't. Rebecca placed a second document beside the first, then a third. The original letters from Richard Harrington asking Walter Mercer to buy an easement. If your father believed the HOA already had legal access, Rebecca asked softly, why did he repeatedly offer to purchase it? Melissa's lips parted. No words came out. The silence in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Then Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Miss Harrington, her voice was calm, but unmistakably serious. I suggest you answer counsel's next question very carefully. Rebecca opened one final folder. Inside was a document none of us had seen before that morning, produced by the developer only after the judge's discovery order. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, Confidential Board Memorandum. Rebecca looked at Melissa. Would you please explain to the court why your HOA board discussed the possibility that the Mercer family might one day discover the missing access problem, 18 years before this lawsuit was ever filed? Melissa closed her eyes. The entire courtroom waited. Then she slowly opened them again. She swallowed hard, need to tell the truth. No one in the courtroom moved. Not the reporters, not the residents. Not even Judge Whitmore. Melissa Harrington gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered urgently, You don't have to answer that. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she stared across the courtroom at the rows of Cedar Ridge homeowners who had trusted her for years. Some looked confused, others looked terrified. One elderly couple simply held hands. Melissa took a slow breath. My father. Her voice cracked, never obtained the easement. The room fell silent again. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Continue. Melissa closed her eyes for a moment before speaking. He told the Planning Commission the paperwork would be recorded later. Rebecca stood perfectly still. So the easement never existed. Melissa shook her head. No. And yet construction continued. Yes. Why? Because nobody stopped it. She swallowed hard. My father said once families moved in, no one would ever challenge access. He believed the Mercer family would eventually sell. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Granddad had known. He hadn't been stubborn. He had been protecting the ranch from exactly this. Rebecca walked to the evidence table and picked up the confidential board memorandum. Ms. Harrington, were later HOA boards informed about the lack of legal access? Melissa nodded slowly. Every president received a transition binder. And what did it say? Her shoulders slumped. It warned us never to contact the Mercer family about ownership. The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore struck her gavel sharply. Order. The room quieted. Rebecca continued. Why? Melissa looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand. Because we knew the bridge wasn't ours. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Several Cedar Ridge residents turned toward the HOA board members, seated behind their attorneys. One man stood abruptly. You lied to us? Another shouted. We've been paying dues for bridge maintenance. Melissa lowered her head. We used HOA funds to maintain property we didn't own. Judge Whitmore immediately instructed the bailiff to restore order, before turning to Benton. Counsel, does the defense dispute this testimony? Benton stood slowly. No, Your Honor. It was over. Everyone in the room knew it. Rebecca rested her hands on the counsel table. The plaintiff has no further questions. Judge Whitmore spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing exhibits, making handwritten notes, and reading portions of the development records. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear pages turning. Finally, she removed her glasses. This court is prepared to rule. Every person in the room stood perfectly still. The evidence establishes that Mercer Ranch has continuously owned the bridge and surrounding property. She looked toward me. Mr. Mercer never transferred ownership. Then toward Melissa. No permanent easement was ever recorded. She paused. The developer obtained subdivision approval while representing that legal access would be secured. Another pause. It was not. She turned another page. The HOA subsequently asserted ownership over property it did not possess, issued unlawful fines, authorized trespass, and attempted to exercise authority beyond its legal jurisdiction. Melissa quietly wiped away tears. Judge Whitmore continued. This court therefore declares the following. She raised one finger. First, title to the bridge remains exclusively with Ethan Mercer. A second finger. Second, every HOA fine, notice, assessment, and enforcement action against Mr. Mercer is declared null and void. Third, the HOA is permanently enjoined from entering Mercer property without written permission. She looked toward the defense. Fourth, this matter is referred to the State Attorney General and County District Attorney for review of potential civil fraud, regulatory violations, and any other action deemed appropriate. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed toward the doors to file breaking news. Residents hugged one another. Others looked stunned. Several simply cried. Judge Whitmore struck the gavel again. "I am not finished." Silence returned. Finally, she looked directly at the Cedar Ridge homeowners. The residents before this court are not responsible for the developer's conduct. They purchased homes believing proper legal access existed. Then she turned toward both legal teams. "I strongly encourage immediate negotiations to establish lawful access that fairly compensates the Mercer family while protecting innocent homeowners." It was a practical solution, one my grandfather probably would have respected. Outside the courthouse, microphones surrounded Rebecca and me before we even reached the steps. A reporter asked, "Mr. Mercer, do you feel like you've won?" I looked across the street. Dozens of Cedar Ridge families stood together. Many looked exhausted more than angry. "I never wanted anyone trapped," I said honestly. "I wanted the truth." Another reporter asked, "Will you reopen the bridge?" I nodded. "I've already instructed my attorney to negotiate a temporary access license while the county and residents establish a permanent legal solution." Several homeowners looked visibly relieved. An elderly woman walked through the crowd and stopped in front of me. She introduced herself as Margaret Collins, one of the subdivision's first residents. With tears in her eyes, she said, "We believed everything they told us." I nodded. "I know." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you for fighting." "For what?" So the rest of us finally learned the truth. Over the following months, the consequences spread far beyond one courtroom. The original developer's company faced multiple civil lawsuits. The HOA board resigned almost entirely. State investigators opened formal inquiries into the subdivision's approval process. Several county procedures were rewritten to ensure original access documents could never disappear again. As for Melissa Harrington, she resigned as HOA president the morning after the verdict. Weeks later, she sent me a handwritten letter. It contained no excuses. Only one sentence. "My father started this lie. I should have ended it years ago." For the first time since this nightmare began, I folded the letter, looked across the river toward my family's land, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Several months have passed since the courtroom doors closed behind us, and life has finally settled back into a rhythm that feels familiar. Every morning, I still ride across the ranch before sunrise. The mist still hangs over the river, the cattle still gather near the north pasture, and the old farmhouse still creaks exactly the way it did when my grandfather was alive. The difference is that now, when I cross the bridge, I know its future is finally protected by law instead of assumptions. Working with the county and the Cedar Ridge homeowners, we reached a fair agreement that granted legal access through a properly recorded easement, one that respected my family's property rights, while ensuring innocent residents could safely reach their homes. It took honesty, accountability, and a lot of difficult conversations, but it proved that the truth can solve problems that lies only postpone. This experience taught me something my grandfather understood long before I did. Never assume today's common knowledge is the same as the truth. Documents matter. Integrity matters. And sometimes one person willing to ask a simple question can uncover decades of deception. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or someone trying to claim rights they didn't have, I'd genuinely love to hear your story. Have you ever discovered that something everyone believed turned out to be completely false? Share your experience in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more cinematic HOA battles, property rights dramas, and legal justice stories based on unforgettable neighborhood conflicts, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode. Thank you so much for watching, for supporting the channel, and for spending your time with this story. Until next time, remember, the truth may take years to surface, but once it does, no amount of power can bury it again.